In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can build a full table's worth of 40k terrain pieces that meets competition standard, is flat packable, and is made mostly from scraps that have been lying around the studio. Let's mark those lines and measure that board. For the roll. I've built plenty of pieces for my 40k table that look great and tell a detailed narrative story which I enjoy seeing on my tabletop. Whilst narrative play will always be my preferred style, I've found myself looking at competitive play over the last few months and wanting to explore that side of the hobby. Being relatively new to 40k and looking to grow my skills as a player, I wanted to start getting used to competition spec terrain pieces should I ever wish to enter a competition in the future. So I started looking at the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion, the most recent available at the time of recording, to get an idea of the scale and measurements needed for those terrain pieces. The first thing I noticed, and that's probably obvious to most of you veterans out there, is that whilst it is a three-dimensional game, the terrain and the line of sight itself is set up on a two-dimensional basis, which is a great place for me to start. The companion confirms you'll need the following terrain base sizes to cover all competitive play setups: 4 6x4 inches, 2 10x5 inches, and 6 12x6 inches. I've seen plenty of people use perspex sheets cut to size to great effect, allowing them to see the detail of the battle map below. However, at the beginning of this video I did mention that I wanted to make all of this terrain out of scraps or readily easily available materials that either myself or any crafter would have available to them. I had these thin plywood photo frame backing pieces that had just been sat in the studio doing nothing, waiting for a project, and I thought this would be the perfect place to start. Now, I'm very aware that most of you won't have these specific things available to you, but nothing stops you going to your local hardware store, picking up a thin sheet of ply and cutting it to size with either a handsaw or a jigsaw, and it will give you the exact same result. Most hardware stores will have an off-cut bin that you can just grab stuff out of for free. After cutting these down to size off camera, I took to the edges with some 120 grit sandpaper to bevel the edges so that they would flow onto the battle map smoothly, rather than being a step down. Getting a theme for the board was the next challenge. Tournament terrain packs that you can buy online all look exactly the same. Boxed ruins that have no real life or detail to them, and once again can be a nightmare to store. Rather than the boxy ruins that we see everywhere, I wanted mine to be a little bit different, so I thought we could have more of an industrial style. With all of the terrain bases cut to size, sanded and ready to go, I thought I'd start with 2 of the smaller 6x4 sections. According to the tournament guide, all of the 6x4 sections are all 2 inches or less in height, allowing for the game's movement mechanics to work. I thought that these sections would be perfect for both fences and pipelines. I've gone through how to build both in a previous video, so I won't be going through the full tutorial scenario here, more just an overview. I started with some 25mm PVC piping that I had from a previous pipeline build, and cut these down slightly shorter than the 6-inch width of the base of the terrain. Sanding the pipes down and removing the embossed print so that the paint in the later steps will adhere better. The next step was to take some XPS foam offcuts and cut these out to act as concrete supports for the pipework to sit on, making sure the tallest part of the foam didn't exceed the 2-inch requirements for our terrain rules. I cut mine on a Proxxon, but you can always cut these out with a sharp crafting knife using multiple light strokes. The next step was to take some 90-degree bends and add them to the ends of the pipework so it looks as though it continues into the ground. Once again, removing the embossed markings and sanding down for the later painting step. To enclose the pipework, I made some wire fences from barbecue skewers and wire mesh screen, again covered in the full tutorial in the previous video. Building these to the dimensions needed for this particular terrain piece, 2 inches tall and 6 inches wide. I made a total of 4, one for each side of the 2 sections. My next challenge was to start building the basic structures of the 12x6 board pieces, making sure to follow the tournament guide for the specific dimensions. Firstly, I measured out each of the individual buildings from the markings and made a quick reference guide that I could follow. The base material that I chose for these buildings was spare foam poster board that I had, which you can also pick up from the dollar store or online. I cut panels to fit the size of the dimensions of each building, giving us a basic structure. To start creating some detail with an industrial look, I took some old MDF terrain kit sprues that I have kept, and just began to sort through and cut to size sections that I thought would work well to give my buildings that industrial look whilst not impacting the overall dimensions of the building. If you don't have any of these old sprues, you can also use old GW plastic sprues if you had any of those, which I end up using later on anyway. You could also cut down strips of serial card with varying sharp angles or coffee stirrers to simulate the industrial space age theme. The more the better. The next stage was to add additional levels to the building. Using more foam poster board strips as a base, I cut up some strips of tread plate plasticard that I also had from my 40k Imperial Outpost conversion video, once again reinforcing that industrial theme. These strips were glued together using hot glue and measured to match the long side of the L-shaped buildings, with small strips of poster board added to the walls underneath to act as supports to keep the floor raised. These strips for the floors were wide enough to hold a 40mm base, which covers most infantry units. For the C-shaped buildings, I thought it would be good to create a full floor that would cover the whole building, following the same steps as previous. The only difference was that at this point I'd run out of poster board, so I had to move on to using XPS foam blocks. To secure all of the walls and floors together while still keeping the principle of the terrain being flat packable, I decided to opt for a magnet approach. Once again, I've covered how to do this in depth in my flat pack ruins video, which is also in the description below, but the simple version is that I marked out punch holes at 1 inch from the top and bottom of each of the walls and installed the magnets using hot glue. Test fitting each wall one at a time to make sure that the alignment was right and the magnets were facing the right way. For the floors, I repeated the magnet installation but on the bottom of the floor strips, and then again on the strips of poster board that I placed onto the walls to support the floors. Once all was said and done, I had my basic structures for my 12x6 terrain bases that were all still flat packable. All that remained were 2 more 6x4s and the 2 10x5s. Rather than more of the same, I thought it would be nice to have a little variety. I'd been given these drainage ductings by the wonderful producer Danny H and thought that they matched the theme really well, so I wanted to incorporate these into the remaining pieces. For the 6x4 sections, I cut down the ducting to size using a handsaw and then added another platform on top for the infantry to stand on using the same material as the floors from the buildings. To fill the rest of the piece, I added another set of pipeworks to the rear, filling the section out nicely, whilst also then being less than 2 inches tall all the way across. I then wanted to experiment further with adding cork sheeting to the bases for a little ground texture, cutting out holes for all the pipework returns to sit in, gluing everything down with hot glue and sanding the edges to continue that beveled look. For the 10x5 inch bases, I used more of the ducting for the base of the walls, measuring more XPS foam to act as my basic structure. I mentioned previously that you can also use spare GW sprues that you might have lying around, so that's what I did here to give the walls a similar industrial look, once again locking the pieces together with hot glue. I repeated this for both of the main walls above the vent grating as well as the return wall. The next challenge was to figure out a way to magnetise these walls together. On the main wall, I glued an additional strip of XPS foam which I could then embed magnets into, but for the return wall, I noticed these little circles on the sprue from where I assume the injection moulding is inserted. These happen to be ever so slightly larger than the size of my magnets, so using a pin vise, I drilled out the sections and glued the magnets in. Once dry, I could then use the sections that stand out to make the indentation into the XPS foam strips on the main wall, giving me a perfect measurement for the opposite magnets. It was at this stage that I thought, why not give them a test run? I had a game arranged that same night at my local club with some more experienced players and thought their feedback would be invaluable to see if there's anything I needed to change. We were setting up our first game when a problem decided to rear its ugly head. You see, I'd been using the Terrain Layout 1 diagram inside the guide as a basis for all of my builds, and naively thought that all the other terrain layout diagrams were exactly the same, just rotated. I suppose I just should have guessed with a rule structure this complex that the terrain layouts were never going to be that simple. Oh, for f***'s sake. So it was back to the studio to make the adjustments needed to the structures. Rather than having to build additional structures that were mirrored and waste more time and material, I added additional magnets to the opposite side of the main and return walls, following the same process as before to allow me to have the L-shaped buildings reversible, keeping the floors at the right height and the look of the building still making sense. Now that I had buildings that worked for any layout, and I double and triple checked this time, the last steps were to add the detailed flourishes to the inside of the walls, texture the foam pipework supports, and give everything a layer of Mod Podge to seal off all the exposed foam. The internal walls of the buildings were detailed with old GW sprues that I kept from old kits. If you've happened to thrown yours away over the years, ask other players in your local gaming groups or in the online forums. Most of us in the hobby have stacks of grey plastic sprues just sitting around doing nothing, and I'm sure they'd be happy to give them to you. Plus, it saves them going into landfill. For the uncorked 12 by 6 inch bases, I added a layer of PVA glue to the boards and tipped on some fine builder's sand over some more offcuts of the treadplate plasticard to give them more texture in keeping with the concrete and steel floor, sealing it in with a layer of homemade sealer. My other YouTube videos have guides on how to make this yourself. Once these were all dry, it was time to head outside and give all the pieces a base coat in the grey primer, first layer of black and a second layer of silver. The grey primer will give us a nice base coat to then add the additional colours against. The black will help highlight the silver, which is only really needed as a fine misting to make the piece pop, but will still give the dirty Forge World look to them. After letting everything dry and vent the solvent smell of the spray paint, it was time to add a thin brown wash. Just using a few drops of acrylic ink and a generous amount of water, I slapped on the wash without any direction to simulate the dirty grime build-up that occurs over time. Handy little tip if you're building your own flat packable terrain. Add colour markers to each piece on the building so that you know which pieces go together when you're unpacking them from transport. The 12 by 6 inch bases that had a sand texture were then given a dry brush of light brown, dark brown and a white to give the bases a concrete texture. Be careful not to overload your brush like I did for the white. You can easily add more, but it's difficult to take it away. The last thing was to add a little chainmail silver to the plasticard to bring out the metal look. To bring everything together, I cracked out my new favourite product, the pigment powders. I discussed how much I love these in my Imperial Outpost conversion video, and it still stuns me as to how the small addition will take your builds to a whole new level. With a dark and a light rust colour, I used an old paintbrush to stipple on the powder to add the effect, starting with the dark and then adding the light over the top. The one downside to these little gems is that they make kind of a mess, so make sure to have either a cutting mat or a protective layer over your work surface. You also need to be mindful of locking in the powder to the piece as well, otherwise it will just get all over your hands and clothes whenever you touch them in the future. A cheap and easy tool for this is cheap hairspray from your local pound or dollar store. Ideally, find one that has a non-tacky finish and just coat the piece and let dry. Once all said and done, I can fit a full-size board worth of terrain in a 19 litre, really useful box, perfect for transport with my miniatures. Now, I'm very new to competitive Warhammer and I've likely done something wrong along the way in this video. I'm very aware that different countries will have different rules depending on the competition that you're in, such as the UKTC versus the LTC. If I have got something wrong, let me know in the comments below and I'll pin it to the top of this video so others can learn from it. Again, we're all trying to learn, so be nice. Before we get onto the table shots, take a moment to click those like and subscribe buttons. This really helps channels like mine grow to a much wider audience. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the channel producer, Danny H, and all the other Patreon members. Your support means the world to me and I couldn't do this without you. So, let's see how it looks on the tabletop.